really excited about our topic today, which is kind of a funny thing to say, but it's so timely to be talking about death and literature and how literature and the humanities can add meaning to these kinds of conversations, and a historical look can really give us some insight into these ideas. And to lead us through the conversation is Ashby Kinch. And Ashby is a professor of English literature at the University of Montana, and he specializes in late medieval literature. He's also on the board of the Institute for Health and Humanities and the Humanities Institute. And of course, we know and love him best as a board member for Humanities Montana.
Hi all, good to see all your faces. Oh my gosh, I just see Natasha Morgan popping on. So many great faces. I know several of you from here in Montana, but some of you are from further afield. Natasha is down from Austin, and I see Bob Shelby, my uncle, from Bethesda, Maryland. So we have some interesting faces. I'm not going to make any apologies right from the beginning. I'm going to say we all know Zoom is awkward. It's not really a lecture environment. I'm going to try hard not to lecture. It's very difficult it's against my normal mode for all of those who know me. I really like talking to people and with people, like having back and forth. And, in a second here, when I go to screen share, I won't be able to see everyone's faces, and it'll be hard for me to know how you're reacting. But I really hope you'll use chat actively to follow up on anything I'm talking about and ask questions. And by all means, I feel free to, Sam's going to be monitoring that chat, and she might just throw a hand up. And if it's something that's really, I should stop and we should talk about it, that'd be great. The numbers aren't that big right now, so I think we could probably do it all as group conversation. If it gets up in the 40s, maybe we talk about some breakout groups. So yeah, like Sam said, I'm a medieval scholar, and we found ourselves, there's a phrase a lot of us trade around in my discipline called the shock of the old. We joke about it, but this year it became more than just a joke. As COVID began to spread, the novel coronavirus began to spread, immediately I found myself fielding questions from students and colleagues, and I found a lot of my colleagues around the country pooling resources to talk about some of the cultural analogies and between the Black Plague, which I'm going to get into in a little bit of detail in a second, in our moment. And of course, the differences are gargantuan too. And a lot of my colleagues who are American historians, have been talking about the flu pandemic, which is of course a much, much more salient and immediate cultural context for us as Americans. But, as Sam said, I think a lot of what the work I do in my teaching and in my research is to think about what that bigger cultural and historical perspective can contribute. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit about me and why I researched the topic of death, dying, and grief, and where that came from. As she mentioned, it's one of the things you almost immediately have to say that, people ask me if I'm, I have a dark spirit. I just like talking about death. And it's quite the opposite. I'm actually a very upbeat person. I'm a very positive person. And part of what I've brought to my study of death is, in fact, the importance of us having a kind of enriched and deeper understanding in our personal lives of this unbelievably important, salient, central human event. What I have found is that over the course of 2.5 decades of studying it historically, it's helped me immensely in my personal life to re-engage with the world around me and to be more sympathetic with people when they're going through their own experiences of death and loss. I've had the great honor here in Missoula to work with some hospice organizations. I did training as a hospice aide at one point a couple of years ago, because I really wanted to understand that idea a little bit better and that experience, what it was like. And so I had a lot of interviews with people who work in hospice. So all of that kind of informs how I do my research. It's part of the context for me, is that, in 21st century America, I think most of us know we don't die well. We do not do this fundamental thing well at all. And just even saying it that way seems a little weird, like it's something you do well or poorly, but I'm going to get into that a little bit about some of the ways in which sociological research has told us what we say we want when we're dying is actually not what we get. Most of us will say we want a certain set of experiences there in our end of life, and then we generally don't get them. And what has been really salient for me just in the last 6 months has been to really pay close attention to that, in addition to what we're all worried about, which is the health and well-being of our communities and our loved ones and our relatives. I've also been paying attention to how we're talking about the death and dying process during COVID. And I'm sure you have as well. And I'm sure you've seen some of these wrenching stories and read about them. I think there's been some incredibly good reporting about this. The Washington Post in particular, if you haven't seen their series, it's really worth digging into. They've done an amazing job of just kind of capturing some of that personal voice of the experience. So I can talk about a couple of those things toward the end. And I also kind of thought I might end, have any of you, you can just kind of throw your hand up because I can see most of your faces now. Have any of you read the recent story by Lori Moore in the New Yorker? It's called FaceTime. See, Kim is saying yes. It is, and Bob Shelby too, it is an absolutely beautiful story, and I strongly recommend it. Of all the things that I've read, recently, that's the one that seems to capture this moment in a penetrating, deep way for me. And so maybe by the end we'll kind of get there, and I'll talk a little bit about the story. But I definitely don't want to. I want you to have the experience of reading it yourself. If only two of you have read it. But in between, I was going to just talk a little bit about my scholarship, and I've got a ton of slides. I won't go through all of them, definitely, and I definitely won't linger on them very long unless you really want me to. But I thought part of what I would do is just talk a little bit about how I came to the topic and the kinds of research I do as a medievalist. Also, just want to start by saying, there's going to be a little bit less literature and a little bit more art in the slides, which is not to say I don't want to talk about literature, but it's to say that it's a little easier to communicate visually some of the ideas I want to talk about. And so I'll have some manuscript images and some church interior shots of churches. So let me get to a share screen and we'll get into that. So I kind of slightly, pandemics and cultures of death, dying, and grief is kind of how I retitled it. And I just wanted to start with this shocking juxtaposition. Speaking of shock of the old, I'm sure many of you saw that photo from Hart Island in New York, where they were forced to bury bodies in a mass grave during the height of the ravaging and the deaths due to COVID. But I wanted to show you on the left-hand side of your screen there will be an image from a manuscript of Boccaccio's Decameron showing a mass grave being dug. And so just, it's a juxtaposition to just start out kind of thinking about some of the analogies we could begin to build. It's really important, of course, here in Montana, and actually, you guys can all use chat for this as well. I mean, it's something we've been doing a little bit more often in Montana, but wherever you are in the United States, you're actually on indigenous land. It doesn't matter where you are. But here in Montana, we really think it's important to acknowledge it. And at University of Montana, this is our official statement that we acknowledge we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispee peoples of Montana. We honor the path they have always shown us in caring for this place for the generations to come. And I'm going to immediately make a segue to an image, series of images, actually. You all know what this is. This is the Milky Way, but over a very particular set of mountains. This is the Mission Mountains. And Shondine Pete, I had the great privilege last year to moderate a panel on cross-cultural perspectives on death, dying, and grief last fall, where we had 10 presenters talking from a range of religious and cultural traditions about their beliefs about death and dying. And Shondine shared a story which he gave me permission to share with others, but I want to honor and acknowledge it as a Salish star story, and the image of the ancestors who walk the Milky Way. So in the Salish tradition, as the dying person goes through their last days, they return to the ancestral lands where they did all of their major life activities, where they hunted, where they gathered bitter roots, and then their soul rises up above the mountains and climbs into the Milky Way. And the stars are the campfires lit by the ancestors at night as they pause on their journey back to the Creator. So I thought I would start with that as just a kind of still and calming image. And there'll be several of these with that idea in mind. I think you can see so much more deeply into these beautiful images of the Milky Way, all taken from Western Montana. And then here's a more shocking juxtaposition, right? Here's a nurse in hospice care completely dressed to bring food in to a dying patient. And then on the right, of course, the makeshift morgues that we saw all around New York as they tried to deal with the overflow of dead bodies. So here's some just broad questions that I think are important for us to ask and to think about the difference between how we might approach this topic if we were thinking about it from a medical perspective, right, versus a cultural perspective. So, when thinking about the Black Plague, we can ask, what expectations would we have for art, culture, and literature during a pandemic? Would we expect literature to address it directly or not? Would we expect it to be more indirect or even maybe to be silent? When we think of the past in particular, what role do we think culture might play in helping people navigate mass death events? What ideas about the nature or role of art might guide those suppositions? And what new story can we tell about our deaths that might liberate us to live better lives? These are some of the deep questions that I think we can get at in this conversation. And then this last one is just one I feel like over and over and over in our society is we kind of have to have this conversation about what the humanities do and how do they talk about these topics in ways that are different from, in this case, let's say a medical or a public health or a scientific experimental or a quantitative approach to death. And of course, all of those are extremely important. And when you get sick, you want technicians in your society that can address all of those things. But I guess what I'm coming at is, what are the things that we need to have in place that lead to cultural health, that allow us to absorb and respond to moments like the one we're in that are unpredictable, or let's say unanticipated, even if they were in fact predicted by many people. So in the American context, these are just the kind of broad ideas about death and dying, and I'm sure they'll resonate with you. So most Americans express a desire to die quickly. You hear this phrased as I want to get hit by a bus, or I want to have a heart attack in my sleep, right? We all want to die quickly, and we don't want to have pain and suffering. But is that how we die? No, not at all. Most are going to die after a protracted illness. About 60% of Americans are going to die after an illness of 2 or 3 months or more. Most Americans are going to want to die at home. Do we have any sense of whether this is going on? We're getting better, but in fact, we're far from that wish being fulfilled. Most Americans are going to die in a medical facility. Most Americans express a desire to die surrounded by loved ones. This makes perfect sense, right? It's a deep traditional convention of bedside dying. But in fact, most are going to die alone or attended only by medical staff. In other words, most people's final moments are not going to be in the presence of a loved one. So most Americans, and this I think is just an important fact, have not been present at a death, nor visited a dying person within a day of their death. And these are kind of important facts about ourselves that we often maybe don't face up to. And these facts, by the way, of course, are coming from social science surveys, medical surveys, public health surveys. They're not, medievalists and humanists are not generating this data, right? This data is coming from medical studies. But I think it's important to have it in our background, because there is a major misfit between what we claim to want and what we want and what actually goes on in our society. And I think, you'll hear me sort of use phrases like, we need to get better at the practice of dying. Part of that practice is being present to the deaths of other people. So, we have this context here in Missoula, Montana. I don't know how many of you knew Dr. Ira Byock when he was here in town. If you're from Missoula, you might know, but he's a major national figure, in fact, in end-of-life care and palliative care. He's now down in California on a major new end-of-life initiative, but he was at Dartmouth for many years. Prior to that, he was here in Missoula in the 90s, working on new assessments for palliative care. And he created this thing called the Missoula VITAS Quality of Life Index. So I always like to give a shout out to him. He's an amazing figure, and someone who, if you're interested in end-of-life care, palliative care, he's someone you should know about. And I'm not going to get into this, but there was a long project developing some aid in dying and new hospice practices in Missoula for about 15 years, from 90 to about 2005. But then my personal context, I've been working on and off and on this topic since all the way back during my dissertation at Michigan, which I worked on from 97 to 2000. And a lot of the work, a lot of the images you'll see came out of frustrations about how my dissertation project kind of came out. It came out very literary, and not, in my opinion, richly engaging with medieval culture. And so I kind of restarted after the dissertation and began taking trips to Europe, where I photographed parish churches and cathedrals in the interior to get my own images of some of the artwork of death and dying and loss. And I'm going to show you some of that in a second. And I'm currently working on an edited collection. It says Bloomsbury 2020, but we all know nothing comes out in 2020. That's been pushed. But that's a collection of essays about cultural history of death from roughly 500 to 1500 that I've been working on with some European scholars. So one of the big ideas that I always like to talk about when I talk about medieval death art is we need to view these images not as like photographs, like that Hart Island photograph, but as mediating our cultural values. That is, representing something that goes beyond just a simple representation of the event. That all of our attitudes and beliefs about death are in some sense mediated. They're mediated by some form or another. And my focus has been on artistic forms. And that's what I'll show you. I've kind of got this broad category that I call Dancing with the Dead to encompass a different attitude towards death that's really important, that differentiates us from the medieval period. And one of the most important ideas is the way that the dead in medieval culture are represented as part of our community. They're not separate from us. They're still integrated and conceived of as another, a famous scholar calls it an extra age group. So rather than being a rupture between us and the dead, they're actually just another age group, superannuated age group just above us. And in some ways, the preparedness and the connectedness, the sense that that we remain tied to them, is part of the overall Christian, obviously, eschatology, that the community of the blessed are reforming over time in another place. One thing I really like to stress is that, and I'll get into maybe a little bit more detail later for those who are interested, or if you have questions, but it's a concept I call affirmative negation, that we tend to think of death almost entirely in terms of privation, that something is lost. But in medieval art, we often see the death moment is almost always incorporated into some other bigger form of affirmation of social identity, religious identity, obviously, community identity, family identity. And I can show you some images where you can see that at work. And then I've already referred to this idea that the late medieval period generated this new text called the Ars Moriendi, which you can translate it as art of dying or craft of dying. But the overall big picture idea for us to think about is approaching our deaths more as a practice, not as an event, and especially not as a medicalized event. So the medicalization of death in our society, I think, fits hand in hand in some ways with the ways in which we've shunted aside and taken it outside of our living communities and made it a kind of exceptional state that lies outside of our day-to-day life. So the genres of art that I've typically focused on are these three big categories. One is simple, just deathbed scenes where a dying person is depicted often in a very big crowd of other figures, some of them living, some of them ghostly, some of them spiritual. There's another genre called the three living and three dead. I'm not going to talk a lot about it today, but it's a wonderful myth of a story in which three aristocrats are out hunting in a forest, and they bump into three skeletons, and there's a dialogue exchanged between the three of them, back and forth between the living and dead. In some versions, the living find out that the dead are their ancestors and that have come back to kind of reproach them for not having prayed for them and not having taken care of their spiritual afterlives. The Dance Macabre is the one we'll spend a little bit more time on, and you probably know that phrase, and you might even know it's Halloween season, although we're probably all not having quite the Halloweens we normally have. But there's some famous music written in the 19th century, that evokes the dancing skeletons. But the actual work of art itself in its own period was slightly different, had a slightly different tonality. It was much more affirmative. It was much more about joining the dead and the living together in a dance. And I'll show you some of those images. For the context of my book that I talked about that came out 2013, I make the point that they all came out, and the major poetic versions of these stories all came out in a 10-year period of time between 1415 and 1425. And that was a period of really radical theological and cultural change. Some of you might know about the Council of Constantine, but this was a period when the church was kind of running through a completely new model for how to engage with the public. And they were, largely speaking, giving up and moving ritual out into lay audiences. So there's a thing called the Devotio Moderna, which is a new style of inward devotion that plays a part in this. But from the standpoint of death, what it meant was people more and more had the tools to take care of their final moments themselves without needing a clerical intervention. And again, if any of this is stuff you want to talk about later, I can follow up on it. So these are just some of these images that I looked at in my book. And I'll go through them really quickly, but as you're looking at them, think of questions or ideas or responses that you might have. I'm going to talk about this one on the right here a little bit later. Aside from their beauty, of course, they're beautiful as well, and that's part of the affirmation. Here's the 3 living and 3 dead image. This is a mural image of the 3 living and 3 dead from Inzat, which is down in South Central France. And I was the first person to publish photos of this mural, something I'm kind of proud of. This was an illegal photo, let's call it. I was standing somewhere when I took this that I should not have been standing, but it's a great photo, so I'm mea culpa. So a lot of older studies of medieval art, and this may be an idea that you have floating around in your own mind about the explosion of macabre art in the late medieval period, was that it was driven by the Black Plague, which began in 1348, and its major first wave was 1348 to 1350, but it of course recurred actually for 250 years before the death rates began to table off in deep into the 17th century. So a lot of people think the Black Plague was a big driver, or they used to think that. They also, sometimes you connect them to the traditional feudal hierarchy. And then another sort of model is to say they were intended to cultivate a culture of fear. This is a famous thesis of Jean Delamue called Sin and Fear. And so all of those things kind of partially explain various parts of this rise of late medieval macabre art, but I don't think quite get it all right. Again, I'm not going to go deep into the historical part of this, but I think it's important to have in our mind that a lot of these art forms predate the major events like the Black Plague, sometimes by decades. And some of the early scholarship was just wrong. They had their facts wrong. And we have recently been able to prove that some of them predate the plague by a long stretch. And so these are the ideas that I've kind of brought to bear on it. I don't know if any of you have encountered Ernst Becker's famous book, The Denial of Death, but that came out in the early 70s. Highly influential, and it was part of a wave of attention to death studies, thanatology in the 70s that led actually to a major cultural change in the United States. The cremation rates in the late 70s skyrocketed for a period of time after this movement. But Becker's big idea was what he called the mortality salience hypothesis, which is the idea that when our deaths are brought to the surface by an event, and obviously COVID is that event for us, right? When it's brought right into directly into our lives, we will tend to have a kind of bifurcated response. We'll tend to embrace some part of our identities that connects to something that's transcendent, and we will tend to reject things that we perceive as being different than ourselves. And so a group of psychologists beginning in the mid 90s started studying this really, really closely. And they developed this idea called the terror management theory, which they've now replicated this study over and over and over in our society. And just to give you one example, if you take a standard questionnaire on free speech, and your control group takes the questionnaire on their tolerance for hearing and engaging with ideas different from their own. And then you inject one question in the survey that directly deals with death. The tolerance data skews dramatically. All of a sudden, people become much, much less tolerant of views that differ from their own. And they've replicated these studies in questions of gender, questions of race, questions of politics, questions of immigration. And so it's a fairly well articulated and well-known body of data that this is just a fact, that when our mortality is threatened, we tend to bifurcate. And so the deep question is, how do we break that? What are the things that we can do in our lives to break that? And actually, the terror management theory, people debate this, but for me, it's pretty obvious. You need to bring what is otherwise a repressed part of your daily life to the surface. You need to make your regular and consistent conscious acknowledgement of your mortality part of your daily life, so that it never is a surprise. It never comes at you as something that will surprise you. And I guess I don't have to make the obvious analogy to what's going on today. And I'd love to hear the rest of your thoughts on this. But I think no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, you're subject to this problem. In other words, if you're in this group today and you're liberal, you're going to say, that's right, all those conservatives, right? But you're part of it too. We're all part of it. In other words, we're all having reactive, polarized responses as a collective. And the collective momentum of that is, I think we can see the effects around us has been catastrophic and destructive. Any questions at this point? Sam, should I take a pause? And
Yeah, what responses do people have? I'm especially interested in the in that idea of like our level of tolerance for talking about death. And Ashby, when we were talking about this earlier, we were kind of saying that this is the one time of year that Americans will deal with death, but it's very much this kind of cartoonish or grotesque thing that's still very other. It's not part of our daily lives.
right.
There was a little piece with the Festival of the Dead in Missoula where I felt for a while that was a way that we were kind of honoring ancestors and thinking about people who had passed and remembering that. But even that festival started to become more of the grotesque, kind of thing. And then there was a pushback in our community against that and saying, it was appropriating and it was not the right way to do it. So yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to jump in and kind of talk about their thoughts so far.
I work in senior care and I do a lot of hospice care as part of that job. And I'm also our family's genealogist. So I'm constantly dealing with the dead people in my family. What I notice in hospice care is the diminishment of the form, but often an expansion of the spirit, which is really beautiful. And I find this happens kind of across the board. It doesn't really matter what somebody's religion is or what their past thought processes have been. As your body diminishes, they say you can be a good example or a horrible warning. A lot of people are a good example of aging and that diminishment and doing it gracefully. So I just find that very interesting that as they get older and become less physically, they become more themselves.
Spiritually, that's beautiful. And that's an experience I had working with hospice workers. They said a very similar thing over and over and over, that some people, the fight takes longer, and I can remember just some wrenching stories and experiences actually of people who, you know, a Vietnam War veteran that I encountered, for example, whose fight was, you know, hard to watch and be part of. But then even he at the end had exactly, I mean, he ended up in a very different place. And I think hospice workers and people who have experienced, you know, death up close, we need to hear their voices more. Part of what we applied for a grant, which we ended up not getting, but then Sam was referring to the festival of remembrance, as it's now called. You know, I was part of the team that was actually trying to pull it away from exactly the cultural carnival model and move it more towards a community engagement that stretched out. And so we started some writing groups, and we had a doctor's group and a nurses group and a hospice group, and then a community group. And over a couple of year periods of time, we just had creative writing instructors working with people to tell their stories and to shape and form them and use them as a tool to kind of make sense of those experiences. And my vision would, my dream would be to eventually try to get a place where that's, you know, books, but also maybe a website that served as a way for us to go and hear these stories. And that to me and my work, that's been part of what I talk a lot about, is that we need in all areas of culture, but especially in death, we need those stories. We need that practice. We're not going to get it in our daily lives the way our societies currently function, but we need that ability through aesthetic form to really start wrapping our heads, hear these multitude of ways that people can turn a really difficult thing into a really beautiful thing. And I can talk a little bit about the dancing performance that we created here 2 years ago, which I'm really proud of. I mean, it was an amazing experience, and it's something I'd love to replicate. But all of us can do this. Our communities can do this. You know, we can reconceive the ways in which we turn those final weeks, months, days, you know, hours into moments of beauty that reaffirm not just the dying person, but also the community that's left behind. There's a great social theorist named Joseph Roach, I really like, American literary scholar, but he uses this term surrogation to explain what happens around somebody's death. And I think we're really running into this during COVID. A little hole breaks out in your community, and you have to figure out how to create surrogates to fill it in. And I was on the phone yesterday with somebody from Great Falls, and I don't even know him that well, but we were talking, and he had to tell me the story about a neighbor who had died and how hard it was on him. And I barely know the guy. And the little opening was, I told him, yeah, tomorrow I'm doing this Humanities Montana thing. And he just is, oh, I got to tell you about this, right? And we need that, you know, no, in other words, it's like a muscle that we have let atrophy. And we need that ability to be able to talk and build that muscle back, that cultural muscle back. Thank you very much for Jenny for bringing that up. And any other questions?
Actually, we've got some really good questions in the chat here.
Okay, great.
Kiri, do you want to unmute and talk about your question about the Great Death?
That's my sister for everybody.
Oh, nice.
If you read it, I'm also making dinner. I apologize.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that image, you know, deep into the 19th century, for those of you who are interested in the American context, I'd strongly recommend This Republic of Suffering by Drew Gilpin Faust. She's a Harvard president and for many years, but a historian before that. And that's a beautiful book. I see Randy nodding. Do you know it? Yeah, it's a really amazing book. And what she details is that the tradition that I study on the front end, that Ars Moriendi tradition, it remains more or less intact deep into the 19th century. That manuals that American families had at their disposal in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s were verbatim the same as the ones that I'm talking about from the 1420s, 30s, and 40s. And you know, it's just a set of protocols to give people a structure to work through those last days, something that's outside themselves. And yeah, and it often involves ritualized goodbyes, ritualized encounters. And so American children before the Civil War it would be very rare for a child who lived to age 5 to reach age 5 and not have been at a bedside death, not have been right next to the bed of somebody who was dying. And just think about what a change that is, right? So here we are 170 years, and we would almost think that's grotesque. We would almost view that as, crazy that you would force a 5-year-old child to be next to the bed. And so I think that gap is what we need to recover. We need to recover that culture of sanity and normalcy around allowing ourselves to learn from the moment of death. And that means learn from a very, very young age, and understand what that means, what loss really means, and have a community that surrounds you that helps you through it.
I think that really relates.
That 5-year-old then learns the practices, learns the things that need to be done, and knows what his or her role is in that, right?
Exactly.
And by the time they're the one who's the daughter, they know what they do. They have all this down, and we don't. I mean, we don't know how to talk about it.
Yeah, I refer to this sometimes in my teaching as the middle of the night problem. If any of us in the middle of the night hear a knock on our door, what's the first thought that goes to your mind? Criminal, something bad going on. In the medieval period, it was obvious what was going on. Your neighbor or someone in your neighborhood is dying, and you were expected to get up, get out of bed, and go help them, and go help that family. And that means cutting the wood for the beer, for the funeral beer. That means bringing food. That means washing the body. So that middle of my sort of bumper sticker for this, lately has been, culture is what happens when the lights are off, not when the lights are on. Culture is what we carry around that we can act on immediately. And our death culture is one that we are way out of practice on. We've lost that muscle. So other questions? Link between our popular culture's fascination with horror. Yeah. What do you think about that, Kim?
It seems to me like some sort of perverted attempt to grapple with the idea by administering tiny shocks to ourselves over and over, rather than in any longer, more sustained thinking or study.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think, I almost say like an abreaction, rather than that we can only think about death as something on the far end of an extreme. So that horror and slasher films are this disruption, and we can view death only in that lens where it's murder. I mean, we're always, my wife Amy is a big fan of British detective shows, right? We're always joking around about these little small towns, like, why does anyone live there? Someone gets killed every week, So for the British, the murder detective show is connected in a similar way. It's this British sensibility that ratiocination, rational thought, and detective work can always find that crime. And yet those crimes, they just keep mounting. The body count keeps stacking up. I think that's really a good point. And I'm seeing now these chat questions. Carla, yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that has become, and my sister's on here, and I'll try to say this without crying, but 2 years ago, almost to the day, is when she died, November 1st. And, and she also had dementia, and it was brutal. It was a brutal, long, slow, difficult journey. I will say that, my son and I flew down there about 9 days before her actual death. And Carrie will affirm this, we had just that one last little moment where all of us were there and there was laughing in the room, and she had not responded in days, actually. And all of a sudden she perked up and she looked around, and she could hear the voices. She could hear that we were there. There were children in the room, Carrie's daughter was in the room, my son was in the room. And it was just that last moment, that last moment of, the people are around me. And again, it wasn't an ideal death by any stretch of the imagination, but I think you make, our cousin appeared and sat with my mom when she passed, and was actually in the room with her in the middle of the night. And I think people do that. I mean, I'm not saying people don't do it. Of course they do. I mean, but we need more of it. We need, that needs to be more normal and natural. Yeah, we got you. Amy.
Yes. Hi, I grew up in the Midwest and moved to the Blackfeet Nation about 20 years ago. And I was struck by. I always felt like, wow, we handle death really kind of weird in our culture and kind of in this unhealthy, like, let's pretend it doesn't exist kind of way, especially after a person dies and the way we treat the body. And I was struck by how the Blackfeet mourn and how they approach death, and in particular how they spend like a week after a death. The family never leaves the body, someone's always with the body, taking care of the body, and the whole community is there. And I was just struck by how much more healthy that seemed than the way I had been brought up in acceptance of, kind of that final stage. And since we're acknowledging our native communities here in Montana, they each have a very different way of handling things, but I do find that they tend to handle it in a way that's a little bit more healthy in a way than the way I was raised anyway.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I couldn't agree more. And I had the great honor, just by complete accident, I had an appointment to meet with the Salish Cultural Council a few years back when I was working on this grant, to be there during a wake. And it was supposed to be a 1-hour meeting, and I was there for 12 hours. And I learned so much on that day. I can't even tell you. I mean, it was a really important moment for me personally. And I agree with you. I think those modalities, the slowness around a death, the way that people put everything aside and come together and do something, those are the modalities that I'm familiar with from the 14th and 15th century, from the work that I do. That's exactly. And so some of this, it has to be said, right? Some of this is the economic determinism of our culture, that we just have a hard time putting a pin in life and stepping aside and doing this important thing. And again, families do this. I'm not saying they don't, but it's hard work, and it doesn't come natural. It doesn't come natural to most Caucasian American families. So thank you for bringing that up. I gave a talk on this topic a few years ago at the library, and a Blackfeet attendant talked about tree and cave burials, and how they had been a key part of the Blackfeet tradition, and that they had been made illegal. And boy, I tell you, talk about something, if you're in your community and you have an ability to apply that lever, listen to their native tribes, listen to how they used to do things, and advocate for them. I think if we could return to some of those traditional belief systems, we'd all be better off. We'd all benefit and improve by having a diversity of practices. And that includes, all the work that gets done around, alternate burial practices. Green burials, I think, are an amazing movement. I think we're being a lot more creative now, and we have new opportunities to really think about that. Okay, I see some questions about pictures. Devilish figure at the foot of the bed. Oh, yeah. I could bring one or two of those back up, because I think that would be, from the standpoint of my research, something fun to talk about. That how crowded the deathbed scene can often be in these medieval images. I'm sorry, I'm struggling to get back to the actual show. And Melissa, I'm not sure which one you were talking about, but I can kind of look at a couple of them. It's a little frustrating because you have to go back. Oh, maybe I'll go to that one right there. Were you thinking about this one?
I think it was the first one. Like there's like a purple devilly figure with like.
I'm kicking myself for how I did this slideshow now, because it's making it hard for me to get back in and out. Well, I'll show this one. I'll just do it this way rather than going into slide view. It'll make it a little easier. This is from a woodcut in the middle of the 15th century. And in the Ars Moriendi tradition, the deathbed scene is often glossed with a series of stages that the dying person has to go through. So this one is called lack of faith. So here's the dying person here. This is his wife and two negotiants who are there actually to talk about his will. And he's going through the phase of doubt. And so he's being tempted by two devils here. And of course, Mary, Jesus, and God himself comforting him from the bedside. So that's where he has to get eventually. He has to turn his gaze toward them. I think, yeah, this one is an interesting one. Was this the one you were thinking of? So what I love about this image is there's a lot to love about it, but they're looking off screen, but there is actually nothing on the other page of this manuscript but words. so this image is, they're looking off screen to the left. And if you just look at the way the image is set up, it's kind of darker here on the right side and a little lighter here. The artist is imagining a shaft of light and a figure who's coming in to resolve. So this is a fairly typical scene, interior scene around a deathbed, where you have the dying person, some kind of negotiant, often more, you'll have a cleric or something like that, but then a devil and an angel, who sometimes the devil will be carrying a balance. In this case, he's carrying a scroll, and that scroll is the list of sins. This is in his hand right here. That's the list of sins of the dying man. And he's there as an adjudicant to say, hey, this guy's mine. He's sinned all of his life and he never expiated. And then the angel is there to defend the soul. And so in almost all these images, it resolves in the way of, if y'all are interested, I could say a little bit more about this. It's kind of interesting. I've got an essay that eventually I will publish. I just haven't worked out all the details. But my hypothesis, I found a whole series of images where a soul is being released from the body, the mouth of the dying body. And that's a traditional last breath image, right? That the soul in the last breath is escaping and going out. So sometimes the window is closed in these images, and sometimes it's open. So in this case, it's closed. And I think there's a set of generic symbols about this, that if the window is closed, the soul's ultimate destiny is in doubt. If it's open, the soul is going to go to heaven. And then another one is, if the soul is, as the little naked body comes out of the mouth, if it's still in contact with the body in any way, it's going to be damned. And if it's been released from the body, it's going to be saved. And so far I've found about 15 images that still have some contact with the body. And in every case, there's no angel in the picture. There's a devil ripping the soul away. So eventually I'll publish that, but I haven't quite yet, lined it all out. And medieval journals are very meticulous about that kind of stuff. But so that was a kind of long digression. I apologize. But specific question? Or I could go to another one. This one on the right, this was the cover of my book. I often use it to talk about framing. If we look closely at this image in tight, you can see here's the devil and the angel over the top of the dying person. He's giving his last prayer, commending his soul. Here is obviously a symbolic representation of death, coming with his arrow. And then of course the loved ones gathered around, and you can see they're reacting. I think this is the most interesting figure in the whole image, because she appears to see this skeleton. In other words, it appears not to be a spectral, it appears to be right there in the room. Here's the broader view, and a key figure in this is the person kneeling here, the cleric who's saying final prayers. And then here's the full image. And this falls into my paradigm of affirmative negation, right? This is, we will tend to focus our attention on the deathbed, and rightly so. But here is the tripartite division of the world. This is actually, those of you who are kind of nerdy and into this stuff, you'll immediately think this is hell, but it can't be. Why? Someone's escaping. So it's actually purgatory. And this is known as the bridge of purgatory. And this soul is being released and coming up into the heaven. And so, these achronological images where all of time is kind of compressed into one thing are pretty common in deathbed imagery. But it shows you that, the sort of event or the drama of the deathbed in medieval culture has this other entire eschatological dimension. We'll tend to zero in on, when we think about medieval culture, we'll tend to zero in on this part, right? The terror and the sin and the forgiveness, but I mean, the suffering, but the forgiveness and the redemption are key components. And you can see this paradigm over and over and over. These are souls being released from purgatory. These are souls in purgatory, and one you can see being released by the prayer of his loved ones here in church. And other forms of affirmation include things like this, where this is a skeletal corpse called a transy corpse. This trend broke out in the early 15th century. And again, people often thought it was related to the Black Plague, but it happens about 80 years after the plague. But if you look, this is what that corpse is looking at. This absolutely beautiful ceiling tile mural, which has that particular person, John Barrett is his name, it has his logo integrated into it. So in fact, this is a vanity plate, right? This is an incredibly ostentatious and luxurious. So although the tomb sculpture is quite austere and stark, what is being represented is, if you sit there and you look at that sculpture and you're fascinated by it, you are essentially aiding in John Barrett's ascension. And the more beautiful and ornate and aesthetically lavish work of art that the corpse is looking up at represents his real social identity. He was a wealthy member of society. Does that make sense? You see this over and over and over again. Here's another example of it: death attacking a prince. This is another one from the same manuscript genre, the Livre de Bonne Mœurs. Death attacking a cleric in this case, but then here's the full image. Death attacks a cleric, and then here he is dying, and here are the saints that have gathered at his deathbed, and you'll notice nothing negative in that space, right? No devil, menacing his soul. This is the ultimate ideal kind of quiet, perfect death. So when I talk about sort of affirmative negation and aesthetic mediation, this is the topos that I'm talking about.
I'd like to say a couple things. One is that Minerva Allen, Assiniboine or Grovant, has written a most wonderful poem called Beautiful Existence, which is about the dying. And it's the most positive experience. So it really has that it isn't necessarily focusing on the other or what might happen later. It is the experience itself. That's
what is that name again?
Minerva Allen, Allen. We published it in Birthright, the OPI publication.
Yeah.
And then within the last 3 weeks, I have spoken with two women who passed the next day.
Wow.
One, her family was singing around her and holding her, and the other one was in Montana and I'm in Minnesota. And so I was reading the 23rd Psalm to her, and they had a phone up to her ear. And then I played a recording of her favorite hymn, which was, oh my gosh, I've got this blank. But anyway, it was a piano recording from a woman who plays at Mayo Clinic after she's finished with her nursing. She plays the piano in the atrium. And I played that, and they said she'd been lying there pretty inert and her eyes just got as wide as can be. And I know that one time you see people gathered around and they think they're just wanting to be just present. And yet the conversations that go on between people often are about the weather. They have nothing to do with ways of lifting. So I had made a comment about my book club in my community having read Being Mortal.
Yeah, the Atul Gawande book. Yeah,
that's right. And it was so powerful. I mean, it was just everybody shared a story of a loved one that had passed, and most of them were not good. So what we were doing was teaching each other about how things might change, what we might look forward to. And anyway, it was a powerful book.
Oh, someone put this over in the chat. Does someone want to to read it?
Oh, that's it. Yeah, that's it.
Would somebody want to read that?
Well, I will. Beautiful existence. Death, my friend, is not long. Wrapped in a tanned buffalo robe, painfully I sank to the floor, forcing my aching knee joints to bend. I sat cross-legged, fumbling for my ceremonial pipe, filling it with tobacco from a small pouch, lit it. Smoke wreathed around my head. I felt for my drum and began a faint tapping on the taut rawhide. The voice that once rang from mountaintops, echoing along beaver streams. Softly I sang a chant of death. All is quiet.
That's great. Thank you
Yeah.
for sharing that.
Linda?
That's really beautiful. And maybe a way to segue into our ending here for the last, we've got 2 minutes, 1 minute. We can stay a little longer if we want, but if anyone needs to go now.
Well, and yeah, and we haven't talked at all about it. And so I didn't say, I'll just say quickly, my big hunch is that in the late 14th century, the communities that were struggling with plague were struggling less hard than we are right now. They knew death. They knew what death looked like, smelled like, tastes like. So they had practical problems on what to do with dead bodies and how to get them out of the streets and how to get good sanitation. And they failed in a lot of those basic tasks that we would consider fundamental. But what they didn't do is freak out. They just went about the work. And I think that one of the most important takeaways from my deep study of the late 14th century is that the biggest impacts were social and economic, not psychological or emotional. There was not a big shift in attitudes towards death. What there was a big shift in was the economy, because 62% of English people died between 1350 and 1370. And that's a pretty major change in your labor economy. So it led to a lot of really important features of modern European societies, from the 15th century forward, including a new kind of economic liberalization. And all the technical details are interesting there, but what it didn't do is change people's attitudes towards death. What it did was reinforce the importance of those communal rituals. And I think we lost those in later periods because of the economic changes. That they came as a secondary or tertiary effect of the economic changes. That was very fast, and it's a very polemical thing to have thrown in there at the very end. But I did want you to sort of, from my standpoint of the death literature, the literature side of the 14th century, texts like Guillaume de Machaut, who gives a beautiful and wrenching firsthand account of hiding out from the plague. It's worth your reading. It will sound familiar. It will sound like somebody who doesn't quite know what's going on, but knows it's best for him not to be moving around, and he hunkers down. And then on a certain day, a certain spring day, he decides to go out again, and he has a vision. And that's what the later poem is. There's about 400 lines describing that experience. And then Boccaccio's famous Decameron is, I'm of the school of thought that he was working on that for about a decade prior to the plague, and that the plague came along and it gave a perfect device for him to frame the collection in, not because the book is about the plague, but about the opposite. It's about how community maintains itself in the face of trauma. And so his famous description there in the introduction, which again, if you haven't read it, I strongly encourage you to do it. It's short and it will ring a lot of bells for you. I put on Facebook a funny kind of glib. I took a famous passage where I'll just give you the first little bit. Some people were of the opinion that living moderately and being abstemious would really help them resist the disease. They formed themselves into companies and lived in isolation from everyone else. Sound familiar? Having come together, they shut themselves up inside houses when no one was sick, and they had ample means to live well, so that while avoiding overindulgence, they still enjoyed the most delicate foods and the best wines in moderation. Costco, anyone? They would not speak with anyone from outside, et cetera, et cetera. Others, holding the contrary opinion, maintain that the surest medicine for such an evil disease was to drink heavily, enjoy life's pleasures, and go about singing and having fun. satisfying their appetites by any means available while laughing at everything and turning whatever happened into a joke. And it goes on like this for 3 paragraphs where he kind of works through what we can now recognize are kind of transhistorical dispositions towards crisis, right? That we will polarize in our responses. And then he eventually settles on a middle band of people who are prudent, and they're not, they're not exposing themselves to illness, but at the same time, they're not denying themselves pleasure. And so I think I fall in that group. I hope I do. But it's been interesting to me to watch our culture kind of work through this problem collectively, and it's really exposed a lot of our weaknesses as a society. It's really exposed just how shallow the soil of a lot of our values go, and how quickly when you get below those, we've fallen back on some very naked, personal, and isolationist tendencies. And again, I don't think that's a political statement. I think most people will read that as political, but I actually don't think it is. I think there's a way of seeing some of the hypocrisy on both sides of the political spectrum. And I would only point to the fact that there was a lot of braying and yelling about listening to the experts, but then the experts, as we all know, they didn't have a handle on this either. They had to switch and adjust to the disease and to us and to all the complexities of it. And so when the expert opinions shifted away from liberal consensus, some liberals were pretty mad about that too. So, I think that this is deeper, in other words, than the left-right divide of our society, which is bad enough. But I think if we can, in our communities, kind of dig in a little bit through that shallower soil. And I truly believe this, maybe naively, but I truly believe that a change in our death cultures is the deepest, most important work we can be doing to rectify some of the other problems that we have. I think if we had a stronger sense of our own mortalities, I think we would reckon with climate change better. I think if we had a stronger sense of our mortalities, we would reckon with our economy better. I think all those things are secondary and tertiary from getting right with what it means to recognize you're not going to be around forever. And so normally in my teaching environments, this is where I would talk about Silicon Valley millionaires and billionaires and their immortality projects, which really deeply concern me. And I think all of us should be concerned when people like Peter Thiel are pumping billions of dollars into research to extend their lives or to make themselves immortal, because we know good and well that is not for us. We know for sure that immortality is the kind of immortality he's going to reserve for him and his closest affiliates. So I threw a lot there at the end, and I apologize, but I was trying to bring it back to the pandemic context and the sort of idea that where we are. And I really strongly recommend this Lori Moore story. I recommend it for a lot of reasons, but particularly in this conversation, the ways in which we've all seen the photos of people trying to look in at loved ones through windows in hospitals. We've heard the stories of people that weren't able to get in close contact and had to watch their spouses die, their spouses of 50 years. They couldn't be there with them in their final moments. And I think that is wrenching, and it's revealing something about us and who we are that I think it's all of us need to have a deep look at it. And I think that Lori Moore story is just powerful because it brings all that to the surface. She uses the device of FaceTime, which is this way that she communicates with her father. The main character communicates with her father, but she actually, in the title of the story, calls it FaceTime. So you catch how important that notion of encounter is in a final moment, whatever form it takes. So there's a kind of redemptive quality to it. And I'll say, just as a side note, you can pay attention to this when you read it. The word COVID literally does not appear in the story. Even though it's clearly about COVID, the whole context is brushed for us in the first 2 sentences of the story. And then really it's a story about a daughter reckoning with saying goodbye to her father under these awful circumstances.
I think that it would be great if we could make a reading list for people to come back to. So this video will be available on YouTube to come back to and watch. We will put that out in our Humanities Montana digital and DIY email, so you can find it there. And if you haven't subscribed, you can find lots of great stuff there. And then we often put explore links, so we can put some reading lists in there. And if anyone wants to suggest things to put on that reading list, please send them to me at info@humanitiesmontana.org. And if you want to send just any other responses or stories or poetry that you want to share, we would love to hear from you. I'm also going to put a quick survey in here. If you would like to just tell us, it takes like 3 minutes to fill out, but just what you thought of today's happy hour. And then we will have another one November 18th. Heather Cahoon will be reading from Horsefly Dress. It's going to be pretty amazing. Ashby, do you know it?
Oh, that is such a beautiful book. And so Heather was incredibly gracious 2 years ago when she had just completed the manuscript. She actually allowed me to teach that book in my death and literature seminar. And she came in and spent 3 hours with my graduate students talking about it. It is a really, really powerful book. I can't recommend it strongly enough. All of you should read it.
Yes, so please join us.
Death is a very important theme in the book, and trauma. Yeah, it's gorgeous.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for being here for our happy hour hour and 10 minutes. It was wonderful to hear from you, Ashby. That was so much interesting information. Thank you all as you say goodbye, and we hope to see you again.
Bye-bye. Good to see you, Natasha, Carrie, Bob, from far away.